Hello, everyone. Welcome to TCAF 2021. My name is Faduma from the programming team at TCAF. Welcome to our panel for this afternoon titled Harm Reduction and Comics. Before we begin, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival would like to honor and acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We are in a territory that was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the land. We also acknowledge that this area is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And TCAF makes this acknowledgement as a reminder that we are all treaty people and that we have a responsibility to the land and each other. And this acknowledgement is a touchstone in our process of thinking through what it means to live and work on colonized land, as an end is an expression of solidarity with our Indigenous siblings. TCAF commits to strengthening its relationship with Indigenous communities in Tikaronto and increasing Indigenous voices and perspectives in our programming. Just a bit of a content warning. Due to the nature of this conversation, things can come up that may get heavy, and I want you to know that it's important as it is to program this. It is also important to take the necessary measures of care of yourself. And as things come up, for example, substance names will come up in this panel, and you don't have to do it alone. So I, Faduma, will be in the chats, and you can private message me, and I will act as an active listener for the duration of this panel. And just in case you need to take a minute from the screen, this panel is recorded and will also be made available on our YouTube channel in a week for a period of 30 days. And with that said, thank you everyone for coming. Just a note, if you want to turn on closed captioning, you can turn it on by clicking on the screen at the bottom of the right corner. Welcome everyone to Harm Reduction in Comics. Harm Reduction in Comics is a super important panel discussion that addresses comic arts and its relationship to facilitating language around harm reduction through nuance and genuine narratives. In other words, keeping it 100. Today we are joined by Michael Linnell, PJ Patten, and this panel is moderated by Ruthie Titus. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will leave the floor open to Ruthie, who will officially start this awesome panel for us. Take it away, Ruthie.
Thank you so much, Faduma. Yeah, just want to welcome and thank everyone for coming today. Really excited to talk a bit about what all of our experiences are and, hear from some folks who've been doing this work for a really long time and who have lived experience in the sector. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more in-depthly and then give you a bit of info on PJ and Michael and open up the floor for them to talk a bit about themselves as well. I have been working in the arts for the past decade and started doing harm reduction like a couple of years ago. And, when the pandemic hit, ended up shifting to more of a primary focus on harm reduction and helped to set up some harm reductive spaces in isolation hotels in Toronto. And currently I'm working at an organization called Pieces to Pathway, which supports LGBTQAA+ youth who are managing substance use. That's a bit about who I am and what I do. PJ Patten is a poet, author, and illustrator. His book, Tower 25, is really wonderful, and I believe that we're going to drop a link if you want to check it out. It's a 128-page graphic memoir about homelessness, addiction, trauma, and his personal path to recovery. PJ, do you want to intro yourself a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the book intro you just read sums it up, but I'm originally I was born in Japan to a Japanese mother and American Marine Corps dad. Grew up in Orange County of the OC TV show. And that's where the book Tower 25 all takes place. Just to clear up the title, because this always comes up, is Tower 25 is the number of the lifeguard tower that I grew up surfing at as a kid. And it also eventually ended up sleeping in the bathroom at the beach for 9 months by that same lifeguard tower. So that's the significance of the title. I just thought I would clear that up in the beginning. And yeah, I got off the streets by spending 10 years living at a Buddhist temple in Northern California, ended up in Canada to go live at another meditation center, met my wife, fell in love, and now I live in Burnaby in British Columbia. And yeah, thanks for having me on here.
Thanks so much for being on here. Michael is UK based and did his first degree in fine arts and got a master's in health education. Has spent 30 years working in the drug sector, doing everything from working on needle exchanges when those were definitely still illegal in the UK to managing drug research projects in Siberia. And is involved with researching, writing, illustrating, designing information products and campaigns for specific groups of drug users and professionals. Michael, do you want to talk a bit about your experience within the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I was the, as far as I'm aware, the first and only artist employed in the drugs field. I don't think anybody quite remembers why. So I kind of backed into this completely accidentally. Had a history as a fine artist. I did my first degree in fine art, but had never drawn a comic before, and got involved in this started doing work in this in 1985, when we were at certainly the height of the scare of what at that time was called the HTLV-3, which later became HIV. And it was really looking at a way of communicating with our primary group at that time, who were mainly rough sleeping heroin users in Manchester. And before what had happened, and I think what still happens with a lot of drugs education, is that a lot of experts sat around in a room and tried to design something that wouldn't get themselves into trouble. And we took a completely different approach, which was that we will speak to that target audience. My office was above a needle exchange that we just opened at that time, so it was fairly easy to do. And it was speaking to them what kind of information would be useful, what kind of harm reduction information would be useful, what kind of language would be useful for a communication, and what type of things were they likely to read, because you could do the best thing in the world and if they didn't read it. And it kind of all started from there.
Awesome. Thanks for that extra piece of background. Just want to check in. Can humans hear me? Am I loud enough? I have a very quiet mic and I'm trying to bring it close to me and speak loudly. Can humans hear this? Awesome. Thank you, Megan. So yeah, we're going to talk a bit about how there's been integration of harm reduction language into comics in both of your work, and what impact that has had and what impact you want that to have, both on yourselves and on community at large. So my first question, I guess, is we understand, or I come from a space where I understand that there's like a continuum of use, and there's addiction, or there's abstinence on one side, and then there's so many different ways to engage with different substances in between that. And I want to hear a bit about what your relationship and understanding of harm reduction is, and how you have integrated that into and spoken on that in the work that you've done.
Sure. For me, I guess it's not about abstinence if we get into harm reduction. For me, I guess it's more about you can be trying to think of how to explain. It's I can be miserable with or without using drugs, right? And so if I feel like harm reduction is just you know what, people aren't going to feel safe enough people don't have to quit doing drugs if they don't want to. I'm just going to throw that out there right now. And if someone does want to maybe reduce using drugs or be able to use drugs safely, I think those are avenues that should be made available. But also too, ultimately, for me, in my own journey, like I was a meth and heroin addict and an opiate user. I was a meth and opiate addict at the age of 15, like full on, was shooting up and everything when I was 18 years old. But eventually what helped me like just take better care of myself was just like figure out what's going on in my head. And I was only able to do that because I really actively went after it. So for me, with like harm reduction and my book and stuff, it's like, if the mental headspace can't be taken care of, then nothing on the surface can last. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but so, and for me, I think that people, at the beginning of the pandemic, my wife and I were going around and I was buying like 12 packs of beer and handing beers out to homeless people, because you know what? They weren't able to recycle cans. They weren't able to do all the things they needed. And these are people that some of them need to drink in order to be sober. And it's like, I'm not here to judge them. So like, yeah, I'll give them $5 or I'll just buy them beer, like people should be happy. And to me, I think harm reduction, my wife made the point that harm reduction is kind of like an expression of like unconditional love for people. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful framing of harm reduction as like unconditional love. And it's definitely true that folks have lost a lot of access to ways that they used to use more safely, regardless of what the substances that they're using. And it's really beautiful that you've taken steps in your life to sort of support some harm reductive, to find ways to support harm reduction for folks who you're not even directly connected with in your personal life. Michael, do you want to speak on a bit about how that
Yeah, I mean,
for you?
I think harm reduction in the 1980s was really controversial. I mean, to the point where when we first started out doing it, we weren't even allowed to meet in some professional organisation's room if we used the word harm reduction. And personally, I've been threatened with arrest and prosecution probably more times than I can even remember. So for me, there's the practical side for harm reduction. It's like, what do you do to somebody now to keep them safer, to reduce the harm? It's recognising that there's a vast spectrum of people who use drugs, from people who are sleeping rough on the streets and injecting, right through to people who go out partying and just having a damn good time, But I think harm reduction for some time now has been a human rights issue. In terms of the international harm reduction movement. So it's treating people, and let's not remember the examples we've had in Thailand and the Philippines of drug users being killed just for being drug users. It's showing that thing, recognizing them, accepting people as human beings, and saying what practical advice that fits into somebody's lifestyle that we can actually do as professionals, rather than standing on a soapbox and kind of moralizing them. And that would be right through from, we would prescribe heroin, right through to saying that for some people, an abstinence-based recovery is the right kind of thing, and giving people those kind of options.
Yeah, I also think that connecting folks to things like safe supply and prescribing heroin or heroin alternatives that fulfill the same need that folks have is such a more empathetic and based in a loving ethic way of supporting folks moving through those things than just assuming that everyone needs to follow an abstinence path. Because for some people, that's just not the right path for them, and that's not how they're going to be able to engage with their substances and get to the core of what their motivation for using is. I've heard you both speak on how you are practicing harm reduction outside of the work that you're creating. Do you feel able to speak a little bit more to how it shows up in the work that you're creating and the ways that your art is connected and based in harm reduction.
Yeah, I was just flipping through the book again really quick. And looking back now at the work itself, I feel that Tower 25, being my own story, was to try to humanize the user, which was myself. That these are all people that, they're people, and I guess for me, like in the harm reduction too, I don't know if I touch on this in the book, but I think if it's on a personal basis, it's like you will slip up, and like it's just really about like self-forgiveness, I guess. I don't know. And I think I get on that in the book, or if maybe it didn't make the final cut, I don't remember, but like when I was trying to get off of meth specifically, it's like I relapsed once, and instead of going on a binge that lasted a year like they would usually last, I was like, okay, it's like okay that I messed up, like just try to do less next time. And eventually that worked for me. And there's I don't know. I'm sorry, I probably don't feel like I'm making a lot of sense. I'm gonna pass on to Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's as, if you like, both as a researcher and as an artist, and there are a lot of similarities between doing ethnographic research with any group of people, no matter who they are, and being an artist. And a lot of that is about trying to get rid of your preconceptions and actually looking what's in front of you. And I remember I did this quite long project with people who'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act. I had to become a temporary member of staff in this locked up, secure unit for people who were suffering severe schizophrenia and are also drug users. And it took a long time to kind of understand the language. People were talking to God as they were talking to me, and all the rest of it. But going in and meeting people every day, this guy turned around to me once and he said, "Do you know when those big black hairy spiders start crawling out your mouth?" And I'm like, "No, I don't." He said, "Well, the big black hairy spiders keep crawling out your mouth. The rock cocaine scares the spiders away. There's no spiders there." So for me, it was like, well, for most people, someone with severe schizophrenia smoking rock cocaine is clearly not a good thing from a health perspective. But if it were me and I had a choice between smoking crack and big black hairy spiders coming out of my mouth, I know which choice I would take. So
yeah,
it's recognizing that there's, from a medical perspective, there may be one thing, but from a human perspective and from what you see in front of you, that it's something different. And for me, telling the stories through cartoons and images and things like that is a mixture of all those things. But it's that putting that person at the center, putting that as a storyteller, putting that person at the center and trying to understand the world that they actually live in, rather than kind of moralizing or anything.
Yeah, I feel like something that I witness in both of your work is that there's like definitely a huge aspect of like the humanization of your subject and telling stories that help to foster empathy for folks who have experiences that are different from the folks that you're talking about, be it PJ with your telling your own story, and or Michael, you are collaborating with folks who have those lived experiences and helping to give a platform for them to speak on, and have like an authentic voice and viewpoint on the subject. And I think that in itself is harm reductive. I think that for me, part of harm reduction is also helping to share narratives that are often silenced, and that in doing that, you help to create more empathetic and loving spaces for those humans to navigate in the world at large. which ideally will lead to a better world. But, you know, we're still working on it.
Yeah, for sure.
Because along those lines, that's like part of the impact that I see the work that both of you are doing having. What do you hope to be the impact of your creating these these pieces and speaking on these narratives?
Yeah, I mean, the whole goal, Tower 25 started off as a journal, as like 2 journal entries that my wife saw, and she encouraged me to keep pursuing it. And this is when I first kind of left. I wasn't a monastic, but I had left living in seclusion, I guess you could at least say it as, for 10 years. So I was really new to just kind of like the world again, in a way. And I was just doing these journal entries, and she encouraged me to pursue it. And then I got into social media, and then it kind of started taking off. And then it was really successful as a webcomic. And at that point, while it was becoming successful as a webcomic, people were reaching out to me, and that encouraged me to keep working on it. And in a really, maybe it's a naive way of looking at things, but maybe optimistic, is that the whole point of the book and the reason I put it out there was to, I mean, one, it helped me, but also like, so people can see what that's like. Like, we're all human, you know, and everybody is worthy of like compassion and just genuine human kindness. And so the goal of the book was that maybe if you don't know what it's like, maybe you can read this, and that'll give you some like ability to like at least see what somebody on the street's going through. Or if you are also from this walk of life, then maybe it'll help you not feel so alone, because the isolation of this type of life is awful sometimes. You know, you feel really cut off from the world. So, and part of this book, you know, if people can get the book that are homeless or in these situations or in juvenile hall, to me, it's like, hey, like, you're not alone. It's like, not, hey, you have to sober up and live a better life. It's not what I'm about. But it's just like, you know what? You're not alone, and what you're going through sucks, but you're not alone, I guess is kind of the point of the book. And that's why the character's faceless the whole book, except for one panel, is so people can see themselves in it, or see somebody they know, or see a stranger.
Yeah, it's so lovely, and sounds like something that resonates with me with what you said is like the piece about like meeting folks where they're at, and like letting them know that they're not alone there. And I think that a lot of services don't do that, and that like you have to meet a standard of sobriety before you can access things to like help you move towards your goals. And so I really think it's just beautiful to be creating things for folks who like aren't there yet, or for folks who like meeting those societal assumptions of like what someone should be aiming for is just not aligned with what they want for their life. And I think it's a huge part of like, again, bringing it back to engaging with folks in like humane ways.
Yeah. Michael, want to jump in, or I'm sorry? And
Yeah,
that's hard because I can't see everybody, so I'm like.
Yeah, I mean, the certainly reflecting people's lives, reflecting people's humour. It's the most successful way to communicate with somebody, and that isn't just my opinion. I actually I did my master's. I went to do my master's degree in health education just to see if there was a theory that fitted this, and there wasn't. All the theories of drug education are based on the premise of stopping people using drugs, which nobody knows how to do anyway. So I looked at communication theory, how you successfully communicate with somebody, and it's a mixture of things. I mean, if I were a doctor and I were, you know, producing something for a woman or a young girl who was having a period for the first time, there may be some respect because I'm a medical person, I may have to understand it. But as a man, I would have no experience of what that was actually going like, what that felt like to go through. So I think humanizing that to gain credibility and to get for the person who reads it to feel as though the writer, the illustrator, has an understanding of that, they have empathy for your position, is really important. And it's a really successful way of kind of communicating as well. Now, that's part of producing a successful message. Within that, I think you have to devise harm reduction information. And for me, that's always been, repeating messages about, not sharing injection equipment, things like that are all well and good. But it's also about talking to that target audience and trying to understand and trying to put a message from their point of view. To give you an example, I'd produced a booklet for young male sex workers who were working in Manchester, the majority of whom were heterosexual, or whatever the political, forgive me if I've not used the politically correct term at the moment. And I got asked to work with a younger group who were hanging around in a park, who were 13, 14. And they were, the way it was described, they were being groomed by paedophiles. And it would have been very easy to say, right, well, look, there's these horrible men who are, basically want to have sex with you, want their friends to take videos and things like that. But when you actually spoke to them, it was very different from their point of view. And it was understanding that and putting the advice within that, because the way they, you'd have to excuse my language, but the way they were describing it is with this particular, very small group, we've been fucked by every adult we've ever met in our life. These people were kind to us. They gave us drugs, they gave us drink, they gave us somewhere warm to stay. And it's like, well, where do you fit in that? Where do you put the kind of advice? So it was very much that saying, well, look, this is reflecting the situation that you're in. If you're going to stay in this situation, you need some of this advice that we've given to young male sex workers about the tricks of the trade, about, studying car doors, all kind of practical kind of stuff like that. So it's a mixture of, for me, of understanding somebody's life and reflecting that so it's credible, and then finding a message within that you obtain for them that makes sense for them, rather than just saying, well, look, don't do this and don't do this and don't do that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're both like practicing harm reduction in your work by using language that is supportive of folks seeing themselves reflected in the work that you're doing, and also by sharing like techniques and tools for folks who, harm reductive techniques and tools for folks within that, so that it feels more accessible for them.
Yeah.
That's really awesome. I guess what also in the language and the tone of what you're sharing, what about the language that you're using and the tone, both verbal and visual, feels important in the message that you want to be sharing, PJ?
Yeah, I saw something come up in the questions about seeing a piece of the work. I know we don't have a screen share, but I did manage to grab a copy of the book. So I'm going to hold it up to the screen, and the text is going to be reversed, but I just want to kind of hold it up just so people can kind of get a look of what the style of the book is. So it's very journal orientated. This is what my journals look like. And so this one's saying, I didn't like myself and I loathed how I felt inside my heart. Drugs helped me plug that hole, or something along those lines. Yeah, plug the hole in my heart, quite literally. And so to me, the words combined with the imagery they enforce each other. There's like a synergy that happens. This is another one of my favorite pages. That was originally a journal entry. It says, the truth of my situation sank in. And it's a guy at the bottom of a garbage can. And that was kind of when I hit my bottom, which was I was digging through the garbage for a piece of foil to smoke meth on. And being homeless already wasn't enough to get there. It wasn't until that moment where I was just like, oh, fuck, like, pardon my language, sorry. Where I was just really, wow, there's no more kidding myself anymore, you know? And so, as I just wanted to share that just because I saw a comment about the artwork. And then, so I guess with the language and the art, I originally drew the book with panels, you know, I started kind of playing around with that and it just didn't work. And so I went back to the original journal format and I just felt that that really worked. Like the tons of negative space, the lack of panels, and it's very sparse. I don't know if that's the right word, but, or stark, very muted colors. And I wanted book to kind of, it's such a heavy subject. So I guess I wanted the book to feel very soft and conversation-like and very personal, you know, like, because it is such a personal subject and story, it's my own. And I didn't want it to come off preachy. You know, I wanted it to be more, I wanted it to feel like you're talking to the person. And so by having all this negative space and lots of space on the pages, I guess my goal was to help create space for the reader to exist and the reader to see themselves or something new on the faces of the character. And yeah, I guess, you know, just like the book was in a way where I hope people felt like they were able to participate in it while they were reading.
I think it's the, I mean, when you produce something, if you produce something that's about a very specific situation or aimed at a very specific group of people, that's the primary target audience. But I think as well that the secondary audience, I mean, you know, I presume that the majority of people who read your book are not going to be homeless, are not going to experience the experiences that you have. But I think that's a really important audience as well, you know, in terms of understanding. From my point of view, I worked for a national drugs charity for nearly 30 years. And I, you know, apart from managing research departments and producing information and comics and the rest of it, I also managed the media work. And I didn't see a separation between the two. Quite often it was about, well, you're producing something for this target group. We knew full well it would be really controversial. We didn't compromise on that. And we used the attacks from the newspapers, government departments, you know, a list too long to mention, and stood up for that and stood up for those kind of principles of saying, well, this is the way the world is, and this is the kind of harm reduction advice, and we're not going along with this game of just pretending that by saying drugs are bad that you're going to solve the problems in any way. So to me, that secondary audience was a much bigger audience, but it was just as an important message as the message we would put into these specific groups as well.
You spoke a little bit there about some of the impacts that creating this work has had on you personally and like the responses publicly. What, if you feel open to sharing, have been like some of the other ways that you personally have been impacted, both like that have felt hard or like pushback? And I'd love to hear pieces that maybe have felt lighter or more positive about your personal experiences of creating this work.
So, sorry, can you repeat the first part of that question? So if people see me doing this, it's because I'm deaf in my right ear, but I have good hearing in my left ear. So I'm kind of leaning into my iPad a little bit more. So I apologize. People keep seeing my left ear.
I'm so sorry. I'll also try and speak more loudly. The question was that I just was coming off of Michael naming a bit about what his experience has been and like the backlash that he's received in producing this work. And I'm wondering what other impacts y'all might have had as the producers of this work, and hoping to hear if there's been any spaces that have felt lighter in this creation and a little bit about what motivates you to keep going with all of that backlash.
I personally haven't really hit up against any backlash with the book. Any personal the one or two critiques I've gotten from it were like, the artwork's a little rough, and I was like, well, you know, the artwork serves the book, right? Also a tattoo artist in my day job, I guess, would be a tattoo artist, so I do a lot of clean line work. So, but this book was drawn in a very specific way that was just personal. But I mean, I guess I'm really lucky because I haven't gotten any like pushback against it. Even my mom and dad were incredibly supportive of it when I created this book, and people that have reached out to me I've really only been blessed by people saying nice things to me so far about it. I don't think the book really takes a viewpoint on anything. I think the book is just kind of exists as a narrative. I'm not sure how it appears to somebody else. I know that when I read, I haven't managed to try reading the book through since it's been published, because every time I do, I start probably breaking down a little bit and get a little emo about it, because it's a painful place to be. And the one thing that I have heard from a couple friends who have read it, who have been in similar life situations as I was, one said she was only able to read like 2 pages at a time, then had to put it down and come back to it the next day. And, you know, so I've gotten a lot of feedback that's an impactful work, and, you know, which feels good. And then my goal is just that to help it, you know, whatever I can do to help it get out there more. And like Michael was saying, the secondary audience, right? Because, I mean, ideally people will read it who have no idea about this, and it'll help maybe generate some understanding or help want to get a conversation going. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Michael, I know that you have had a lot of pushback.
Yeah,
sorry,
I mean,
I'm going to speak more loudly.
yeah. I mean,
pushback.
Yeah, I mean, at one point, I think I went more than 15 years without producing something that hadn't been banned. Every single thing I did was banned, and became quite disappointed if it didn't get banned. And some of it you can take as a joke. I mean, one of the national newspapers said that we were a threat to the youth of Britain, which we had printed into T-shirts, obviously, because that was, you know, something to be proud of. But I mean, this was, you know, before the days of the internet, and, you know, people, it's almost a kind of blood sport being on the internet yourself now. But, you know, if you do something and you get in the public domain, if you stick your head above the parapet, you're going to get knocked off. And it was the, you know, people ringing you up, telling you, you know, they know where your kids live, and, you know, they're going to do this and that to you. That's unpleasant, no matter what you are, which is, you know, I think anybody who's ever been in the public eye would kind of acknowledge that. But for me, it was a job. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't about, I never enjoyed the exposing yourself publicly, being in front of the media, but it was an important part of it to put that message across. And it was very much using the research and the illustrations and publications we'd done for specific groups of drug users to put a message across, both a message about understanding and a message about standing up for those, you know, those specific pieces of harm reduction, which when I started were illegal. You know, needle exchanges when I started were allowed to give out needles. They weren't allowed to give out water and you know, citric acid and kind of things like that. And it was directly through a project that I was involved with that, you know, we were threatened with arrest. We stood up to them and said, take us to court. We believe in this. And this got us far in the end, in that under UK drug paraphernalia law, they threatened to take us to court for giving out a book of matches because it wasn't directly covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act, because people could use that for smoking drugs as well as smoking cigarettes and things. So it became ridiculous. So it's a lot of stress, but you know, it was about, well, what's the aim of this? The original aim of the project was to communicate with a group of people. It was a publication that went out through our needle exchanges to do that with this group of homeless injectors who were injecting rough on the street. We had to get the law of the land changed, and it was like, well, that was, you know, you couldn't separate out the niceties from it. And if you're going to do something like that, you have to expect the fact that you're going to get a pushback in more ways than one.
For sure. One, I just want to note that it's amazing that you did that work at a time when there was, I guess, like more intense pushback than I experienced here in doing that work. So it's still a battle, and like a huge part of doing the work is advocating for clients. And I think that it sounds like you're doing a lot of advocacy in different forms, or you were doing a lot of advocacy in different forms, or different than I primarily do them today. So just want to take a second to thank you for doing that work.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, really amazing. And it sounds like there were like personal impacts. So I thank you for continuing to do that work through those. We are getting close to time, so I wanted to open up to the chat and see if anyone had any questions for PJ, Michael, or myself. And I have more questions for PJ and Michael if folks don't have questions, but just opening up in case anyone does have any questions. We'd love to hear from you. And while folks think on, one second, I'm going to pull up the question. While I'm doing that, I feel like okay, so Patricia asked, Patricia said, I believe in the kind of work you're doing in consent and engaging with the stakeholders in creating the messages and interventions, etc., and honoring lived experiences, but it can be hard to persuade official channels and funders of the value. Do you have a collection of stories or statistics that could help in those conversations? So
I can answer that one. The if you like, the means of production is really important. And what we found was that if you were going to take public money, that you would have never got away with doing what we did. So we set it up so that the organisation I worked for was a charity, a non-profit making charity, but we set it up so that we sold the publications throughout the country to other, needle exchanges. We did work in nightclubs and sold it to nightclubs. So that paid for us to do the work. And it's like if you're working for a public body, you're accountable to that public body. You're not going to be able to get away with it. So either finding a way of doing it for free, or finding an alternative way of funding that's independent, that you've got some control over, is absolutely vital.
Yeah, for sure. PJ, do you want to speak on how you were able to produce your book, and what funding barriers you might have had, or barriers you might have had to producing that story?
Yeah. So like I was saying, it started off as a journal, turned into a webcomic. And then I went through there's two publishers that ran into issues with before Cloudscape Comics published it. And I used to have an art studio, and on an art night, one of the people from Cloudscape happened to pass through my studio and started looking through a collection of loose pages. And to be honest, at that point, I had kind of given up. I didn't want to deal with self-publishing. I didn't, I was just like, whatever. my previous experiences with publishers had kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. And then when Oliver from Cloudscape invited me to submit, I did finally, after kind of brushing it off. And then I got a response pretty quick saying they were interested. And then when I met with Hannah, who's also another one of the editors, and Oliver, they really made me feel welcome and like the story was worth being told. And they were great. I mean, I had such a positive experience with Cloudscape Comics, and like the Kickstarter went really well, and the support from people went really well. I mean, I don't know, I had a really good time with it, other than those first two barriers, which in the comic scene, especially the indie comic scene, there's a lot of labels that are out there that are operating as passion projects that maybe don't have the ability to pull things off, or people that were really touched by the story and wanted to like do something about it, but maybe didn't have the experience in trying to release a graphic novel. That was what happened with one publisher. Like they wanted it, but then they were like, wait, we normally do young adult or youth books. This book is not like that. So, you know, I mean, yeah, I didn't give up. I kept at it, and, you know, now it's out there. And yeah, I'm really grateful that it's out and people are starting to read it now. You know.
Lawrence asked about how either of you would address the current opioid crisis through the use of comic art.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about getting into that, and I have some sketches I haven't published. I was just looking in the Q&A, and I saw someone talking about, yeah, how to use it. I mean, ideally, if I had the funding or the time, or we weren't in pandemic, there's so many what ifs, but if I could do it, I've always kind of wanted to actually go out and interview people and give them the chance to explain things and kind of do artwork with the words of people and put that into a volume about so people actually hearing from people that are currently in the opioid crisis. And as a bit of a tangent on that, like a lot of people I feel like didn't really care at the beginning until fentanyl really started getting mixed in with drugs that people were like recreational users were doing. And then as soon as that happened, it seemed like the public started to care more. When it was just homeless people or marginalized people dying from drug use, I felt like it wasn't taken as seriously. But as soon as like, you know, oh, I'm just gonna go like snort a line of Coke on the weekend, and those people started dying because Coke has such like a upper class vibe to it, then all of a sudden people started caring about drug supplies. So take that for what it is. That's kind of my rant about it though. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I just, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, well, from my point of view, I mean, in the UK, I know a little bit about the situation in Canada. It's quite different in the UK. We don't have, the heroin isn't adulterated with fentanyl. It's actually quite rare. Deaths from fentanyl are quite rare. But for 5 years, we've had record numbers of drug-related deaths. And I would strongly agree that, you know, if these are middle class, you know, young kids, that something gets done. But if they're, you know, the people from the poorest section of your society, then nobody cares as much. So I think communicating those messages about looking after your friends, about not using drugs alone, about what to do in an overdose emergency, about carrying fentanyl, about, you know, tasting your hip before you inject it, you know, any new batch of drugs, kind of things like that. Those are messages we've been giving out for 30 years, and those are messages that are effective and do make some difference. But, you know, I think, as I said, the UK situation is different from Canada, but the people you find on the street using drugs are the same anywhere you go in the world. They're the poorest people in your society. You're not going to solve that by comic books. You're not going to solve that by a harm reduction intervention. You can only do so much. You have to change the world. You know, it's get rid of poverty, and you'll get rid of a lot of these drug problems. You'll get rid of a lot of these deaths. Doesn't mean to say that that people will stop taking drugs. People take drugs who've got plenty of money for loads of different reasons, but you can't separate that out. So I think it's partly how you would address that in terms of information, but a large part of it as well is screaming about what's going on and saying that, you need to introduce social services, you need to, to change your society in some way to get rid of this poverty and this deprivation before you start talking about solving an opioid crisis or anything like that. You can't neatly separate that out from,
Yeah, it
No.
resonates with me that. Oh, go PJ.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with him, yeah, sums it up.
Yeah. I was also going to agree, and just like I was going to mirror a very similar sentiment. And I want to note that we're actually coming to the end of this panel. And that feels like a good note to wrap up on. I want to thank everyone for all of your questions, and offer that folks can be accessed on the panels that have been shared. I think that most of us have been posted to TCAF social media, so if you have further questions, I feel open to receiving questions there and continuing the conversation, because I feel like there are some topics that we had to do a little rush through and would love to talk more about them.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna, PJ?
Oh, no, I was gonna say, I shared my Instagram in the chat. So if anybody wants to reach out to me, wants to chat about things, please feel free to get at me that way.
I'll also share mine, and Michael, feel free to share whatever way you are open to being contacted, if so. Also, I'm going to hand it back over to Faduma. And thank you so much to everyone who came and participated in this chat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to PJ Patten, Michael Linnell, and Ruthie Titus. Thank you for sharing your truth. The human-centered approach to harm reduction has come a long way, and we're all coming into understanding a bit better what are the roles we take on as community members, friends, family, and owning our lived experience through harm reduction as well, and the language of it. Michael's work can be found at michaellinnell.org.uk. Is a great archive of all the comics that Michael has worked on. And so, yes, and PJ Patten's work can be found in our marketplace during TCAF. So feel free to check that out through Cloudspace Publisher. And also we've shared the link to Pieces of Pathways that Ruthie has brought up. And so, yeah. TCAF is brought to you in part by Seneca College School of Creative Arts and Animation. The special thanks to the Beguiling Books and Art, Page and Panel, the TCAF shop, with government support from Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council, and Toronto Arts Council. Again, you can check out our online marketplace to get your hands on all the wonderful comics and art from our amazing lineup of creators. And if you're looking for your favorite artists, we have a very cool list of exhibitors to navigate on our website. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you are enjoying TCAF.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
It was nice meeting you, Michael and Ruthie.
And you. Bye-bye.